Well, it's a distinct pleasure and privilege to be able to introduce Professor Pabst on behalf of the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture. Professor Pabst is, as Stephen mentioned, Professor of Politics and Head of the School of Politics and IR at the University of Kent. He's also a Fellow of the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, and recently the Sir Peter Lawler Visiting Fellow of the PM Glynn Institute of the Australian Catholic University. And we're very grateful to the PM Glynn Institute for loaning Professor Pabst to us this afternoon and for joining us in the conversation. So thank you.
The Director, Michael Casey. Lovely to have you. And Damien? Thanks.
Professor Pabst is one of those prolific authors that makes you feel lazy if you're only publishing a book every 3 to 4 years. He has published not one but 2 books this year, one of which was Story of Our Country, Labor's Vision for Australia, which was launched at Parliament House only several hours ago by the Honourable Mark Butler. But he's also published this year a book called The Demons of Liberal Democracy. And late last year, not to be outdone, he published Liberal World Order and Its Critics. And as many will know, only several years ago, with distinguished scholar John Milbank, he published or co-authored The Politics of Virtue, Post-Liberalism and the Human Future, a book which has rightly garnered a lot of attention and engagement across the world, including here in Australia. Professor Pabst is a wide-ranging thinker who combines both an impressive depth and breadth of insight, knowledge, and interest that spans across the spectrum of political thought. He is at the forefront of attempts to understand our current liberal democratic political culture and order in an age of disruption, and offers an innovative and creative vision of how that culture and order might be set right. And he's going to lead us today in a very aptly titled seminar, The Failure of Liberal Democracy, Prospects for a Politics of the Common Good. Professor Pabst, we're really grateful that you agreed to do this seminar with us, and we're all very much looking forward to what you have to say and joining with you in discussion.
Well, Jonathan, thank you so much for your more than generous words of welcome. Stephen, can I thank you for hosting me, and for real delight to be here, not just on a fleeting visit, but for a conversation. I look very much forward to it. And in that spirit, I shall try to be brief, but as you know, whenever anyone says that, especially an academic, you're in for a kind of Fidel Castro style 6-hour lecture. Well, I won't do that because I would be abusing your hospitality and missing my flight. So I will try and limit myself to 20 minutes or so. I mean, your introduction was really not just more than generous, but far too generous. I remember when I interviewed for the lectureship at Kent, the then Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences invited me into a room. So I'd done my presentation, and this was the interview bit. There was the Dean and head of school and a couple of professors around the table, and the Dean sort of asked me to come in, and I sat down, and he was flicking through my CV. And there was a long silence. I mean, it was most certainly several minutes. And I started thinking, okay, fine, he hasn't had time to read it, I understand. And then he looked up and he said, it's all very interesting, but would you mind telling me where the focus is? And so I thought that's not going well, but somehow miraculously, possibly because I was the only candidate, I did that well. So, same was true for head of school, I was also the only candidate. So, a lot of these plaudits are not deserved, but thank you so much for the invitation and for your interest in the work. I'm going to try and speak in roughly 3 parts. The first is on liberalism and populism, the second on what I call the demons of liberal democracy, and the third on the politics of the common good. And I suppose the starting point really of the book and some of that work is simply to say that far from condemning the whole of the liberal tradition, I'm more concerned with contemporary liberalism. And I think contemporary liberalism, certainly as it's emerged in the 1960s, sort of more social cultural liberalism that we associate with the left, and then the economic liberalism that sort of emerged in the 1980s that we associate with the political right, I think pose some fundamental problems. because they're all about negative freedom, they're all about the primacy of the individual, they're all about essentially a form of atomized existence rather than building a common life, which I think is what democracy is or should be about. But then there's also the argument that this is not an accident. This is not just that contemporary liberalism somehow got it wrong, and can't we just go back to a better liberalism, maybe in the post-war era or in the 19th century. I think there are some more fundamental problems with liberalism too. And the most fundamental problems with liberalism really are that at heart, with some exception, but at heart, liberalism is nominalist and it's voluntarist. In this sense, that it doesn't really believe in the existence of universals in the real world, and it is predicated on the triumph of will over intellect. Now, that itself would require a long exposition, but I would put that forward for discussion, that there is a sort of nominalist and voluntarist core to liberalism, and there's plenty of scholarships, including by people like the Swiss philosopher André de Murat, that have shown that this can be traced in the history of Western political thought. I think Larry Siedentop, who puts up a very interesting defense of liberalism, makes similar points, just comes to a different conclusion. But I do think that these are fundamental problems with liberalism that I think we're now seeing being, in some sense, acted out. So what used to be a debate that was largely about theoretical assumptions, about the sort of deep presuppositions of liberalism, has now actually turned into a debate about what are the real consequences of liberalism as it exists. So it's not just that we can object to it and say, oh, why not consider socialism or conservatism, as if this was just a debate of ideas. We can now see that really existing liberalism brings about a number of very, very pressing problems like social isolation, the atomization of society, distrust and conflict that were initially its presuppositions, but that certain liberal institutions and practices, I think, do foster. Now, I would also say that there are other traditions in liberalism that would not lead to the same outcome. There is, for instance, the new liberalism of T.H. Green, of Hobson and Hobhouse, which is a very important part, but I don't think that's been politically drawn upon much. I mean, Joe Grimman in the UK was one of the few late liberal leaders who actually had an account of human beings as social and political beings. And he kept on saying, the societies to the individual like water is to fish. I mean, it's absolutely vital to think about social embedding, but I think that's the exception in recent history, not so much the norm. And then there's the French social philosophy of liberalism in France with Constant Guizot, Tocqueville and others. There is a very rich tradition that I think is much more interesting, but I think some of these strands of liberalism, going back to Locke and Hobbes and Rousseau and Kant, and more recently elements of Rawls, not all, but elements of Rawls and Raz and others, I think do pose some fundamental problems. But leaving aside the more theoretical debate, nowadays we can also see that the sort of liberalism that we've had has created a backlash. And we may not like the shape and the form the backlash takes, but a lot of the support for populists or insurgents, as I prefer to call them, because I'm not sure populism is a happy term, not least because certain liberals can be populists in their methods. But the kind of insurgency that is sort of sweeping Western politics with Brexit, Trump, people in Italy, but also Syriza in Greece until it was defeated earlier this year, Podemos in Spain, and there are lots of insurgent parties on the left and the right that we can think of, I think is in part a backlash against a liberal model that simply does not reflect the needs and interests of a majority. And what this backlash is about is a certain insecurity that is both economic and cultural. It's the idea that your job doesn't enable you to feed yourself and your loved ones. It's precarious, it's badly paid, often there's no training at all involved, and more often than not you need 2 or 3 jobs to really provide for the family. And the cultural insecurity is essentially about a threat to ways of life which are by no means perfect, and there was never a golden age to go back to, but nevertheless they gave people some sense of stability and security and some sense of esteem, the sense of belonging. And a lot of that is under threat because much of contemporary liberalism really champions change, mobility, and again, individual choice in the sense of negative freedom. So freedom from constraints, an absence of constraints really on our individual ability to choose, rather than the question of, what's freedom for? What's the purpose of freedom? How can we lead free, yet also meaningful and secure lives with a common purpose, or at least where we try and build a common life with others, which again I think is what's so vital to democracy. Now, just like liberalism isn't one thing, populism isn't one thing either. It's by no means monolithic. So part of populism, you could say, is a backlash, and some have called it a necessary corrective. Not a sufficient one, but a necessary corrective to liberalism gone wrong. But of course, there's a much different side to populism, which is the one that slides into not just protectionism, but nationalism and atavism, that is often linked to a politics of violence, not just protest, and indeed some darker forces that could be sort of neo-fascist on the far right or sort of neo-eugenics on the far left. And so I think it's important to realize that behind the labels of liberalism and populism, we get some very, very different creatures, as it were. And here I think that the argument, which isn't in the book, which I think is important to make now, is that there's even a bifurcation on both sides. So liberalism isn't just economic and social liberalism, some call it neoliberalism. There now seems to be a sort of libertarian sort of offshoot, which is also sometimes linked to nationalism. So you get very strange phenomena, like for instance, of libertarian nationalism in the case of elements of the Trump administration, or I think Boris Johnson. Where, they want no regulation, they want out of the EU, or Trump wants no global governance or multilateral institutions. And there's a sort of nationalist rhetoric there. It's both sort of ethnically centered, but also to do with, basically more neoliberalism in one country. So you have protectionist borders, but you also support Wall Street and Silicon Valley. It's a very, very strange sort of set of phenomena. And I think on the populist side, similarly, you can kind of get a strongly anti-liberal populism that is against individual, wants to roll back freedoms, wants to roll back non-discrimination, wants to undo all of these things. And you get a kind of post-liberal populism that says, no, we're going to keep those things, but we're now going to stress mutual obligations, greater social solidarity, and we're going to try and bring about, a politics that speaks more to a sense of security as well as individual agency and autonomy. So I think these, even the liberal versus populist binary doesn't work. And I think the really fundamental argument is that binaries generally don't capture very well our everyday experience, because reality isn't kind of reducible to binaries. Binaries are useful distinctions. We all have left arms and legs and a left and a right brain and so on, but what we don't have is a reality that can be divided into these things. If they had a kind of ontological existence, again it goes back to nominalism. A lot of binaries are purely nominalist. They are not grounded in reality in any ontological sense of the term. And I suppose finally on this, it's really, I think, the case now that as binaries break down, we need to think how we can recover a more holistic and also more plural account of reality, and then a politics that might mirror that. And I think one of the best ways to try and think about where we are is, I think, to consider what Antonio Gramsci said when he talked about the end of hegemony. There's no liberal hegemony now, but I think the populists aren't quite hegemonic either. And what does he say? When there's no hegemony, there's an interregnum, as he calls it. And in the interregnum, and this is almost a word-for-word quote, we see all sorts of morbid symptoms. He even talks in another part of the prison notebooks on the fraternization of morbid symptoms. And I think you could say that certain forms of liberalism and certain forms of populism are in secret collusion with one another. They fuel each other. The more you have liberalism, the more the populists will say this is anti-democratic and you need to back us to recover a sense of democracy and national sovereignty. And the more you have the populist insurgency, the liberals will say you need technocracy and stable government to guard you against those fanatics and extremists, right? This is clearly a sort of secret collusive convergence, which is very much hollowing out a sort of radical centre, in the sense of a centre that I think can offer a politics that will be, again, about economic justice, but also social stability. I'll say more about that towards the end. So let me move on from there to say something very brief about those demons, and that might be a word that is perhaps ill-chosen, but it was really to sort of suggest that some of the ancient critiques of democracy are not altogether wrong, that there's something to be learned from Plato, Aristotle, and Cicero, and they warned that under certain circumstances democracy can slide into what I call these four demons. So the first one would be oligarchy, the second demon is demagogy or demagoguery, the third demon is anarchy, and the fourth demon is tyranny. I'll say something very brief about the four. So oligarchy is very simply the concentration of wealth and power. So you might say big business and big government on the one side against society and most ordinary people, extracting rents, a capitalism based on speculation, destruction rather than production and the generation of real value. And essentially, not just monopoly, which is one problem, but really the sense in which very few control and own and extract profit from essentially the resources that should be shared. And there's no sense of common land or any sort of public shared resources. It's all in the hands of oligarchic groups. And that's not just true of countries like China and Russia, though they certainly have it and more so than we do. You know, we have the big banks and the tech platforms where often something similar is going on. So before we start lecturing the rest of the world about what they should do, and yes, they should be having the rule of law and so on, I think we also need to be clear that that system of rule of law and parliamentary democracy isn't at the moment tackling some of those oligarchic structures. And I'll try and say in the book a bit more what could be done, but I'll get onto that in a minute. The second demon is that of demagogy, which I think is more evident in the sense that I think across the political spectrum, and again, I would not exclude anyone from this, I think we do see a politics of sophistry, where it's just the reign of opinion, and often opinion backed by power. It's a manipulation of, I think, not just public opinion, that always happens in politics, but of, I think, what people's needs and concerns really are. And more fundamentally than that even, it is a form of sort of the reign of not just post-truth, but untruth. That truth itself has been completely delegitimated. So we're now basically told that, you know, we should either just have pure facts, because there's no other debate to be had about what's true or good or, you know, beautiful, just the facts, and it's often associated with technocracy, or else we kind of have post-truth fake news, you know, it is whatever you say it is. And, you know, a tweet by Donald Trump sort of takes on its own life. It now seems to supersede, you know, any reality that's out there. And I do think that that's a threat to anything like a democratic politics that tries to discern not just the truth in any abstract sense, because democracy isn't really concerned with that, but at least a sort of sense of truthfulness. You know, where are people at? What do they really want? What is right for the majority that still respects the needs of minorities as well? So I think that's lacking from liberal democracy sorely at the moment. But I would make the point again that some of the populist methods are not just the case of populist movements or candidates. You see populist methods also used by the establishment. I mean, to give you just one example, Tony Blair, right, famously said, tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime. Now, perhaps he captured a certain mood about law and order, you know, but the point is that is, of course, a populist way of talking about these things. Or, you know, education, education, education. These are all populist slogans. So, you know, populism isn't, in that sense, isn't the monopoly of the insurgents. Then the third demon is anarchy, not in the philosophical sense of anarchy or anarchism, which is actually quite a rich political tradition, but rather in the more straightforward sense of lack of social cohesion, social isolation, fragmentation, you know, the absence of social ties or civic bonds that actually can bind us together and give some meaning to democracy and citizenship and the things we should try and hold in common or build in common. And I think that is also linked to negative freedom, primacy of the individual, to which populists have no answer other than imposing the will of the people. That leaves us just as atomized, because the will of the people in the monolithic sense, you might say the kind of Rousseauian sense, does nothing to recognize people as they are in their families or communities or professional associations or religious faith groups and so on. I mean, the end result is just as atomizing as that of, I think, contemporary liberalism. And then finally, tyranny, by which I do not mean ancient despotism or 20th century totalitarianism. I really don't. And thank goodness we don't have either. But rather what Alexis de Tocqueville described in Democracy in America as the tyranny of voluntary servitude. That through a combination of either cultural conformism or a lack of courage, we become compliant, we become obsequious, we don't challenge the dominant liberal or populist consensus or settlement. And that because we don't have an ability to articulate shared purpose and don't have collective action to give some meaning to that, we essentially become pretty much powerless, faced with oligarchy, demagogy, and anarchy. And so that there is a sort of de facto tyrannical rule, which can take the form of a state, right, which might pretend to be all benign and paternalistic, but actually robs of dignity and agency, or the unfettered global market, which may do just the same. And I think it's the absence of sort of collective action that really is at the heart of this tyranny of voluntary servitude. Now, at this point, you might think, well, this is hopelessly sort of dark, gloomy, and pessimism would be a polite or positive way of putting this. But no, it's not, because I think quite simply that it does not reflect reality or our lived experience, and there are ways of brokering a politics for the common good. And the reason why it doesn't capture reality or people's experience is that it's essentially predicated on a very impoverished anthropology. It's still making the assumption that we are at heart selfish, greedy, distrustful of others, prone to violence, and that the only way to regulate our completely depraved nature is to have either the state or the market or a combination of the two to just kind of make us a little bit less depraved. And that's sort of as good as it can be. In other words, it's something which is bringing about the very pessimism it assumes. Right? By assuming we are selfish, greedy, distrustful of others and prone to violence, you set up institutions that actually end up producing that which you assumed. And I think that's the great contradiction, but also the great source of hope, because the moment you have politics and institutions that actually reflect our human nature rather better, I think you can also suggest that the outcome might be quite different. So a politics of the common good would be a politics that starts with where people are, starts with very fundamental anthropological assumptions about our quest or yearning for mutual recognition, rather than somehow our pursuit of power or pleasure or wealth. And it's not to say that we don't also seek power, pleasure, and wealth, but the question is what kind of power, pleasure, wealth, and is that really the dominant quest, or are they secondary to perhaps a more fundamental quest, which is that of mutual recognition, to be recognized for your vocation, for your talents, for your role in society, for the contribution you make. And that basically means a politics that starts with people and place, that people have some affection for the people closest to them, for the places they inhabit. And that's not to say that all relationships and all institutions that we're embedded in are good, but it's essentially the Burkean argument that we are affective creatures. And yes, reason and rationality are hugely important, but we are also creatures of moral sentiment. And of course there are multiple sources for that. I just choose Burke partly to annoy Wayne, so I'm sure he's going to object to that and much else. But I think Burke has something right about affection and attachments. And it's not just the one quote about the platoons. I think there's much more he says in a number of his writings about how that is a more fundamental driver of human beings, to use a horribly sort of political sciencey term. Forgive me, I'm surrounded by political scientists, so it does rub off. And then it is to think about how can we make relationships and institutions more fundamental and transactions and networks a little less. And transaction networks have their have their place, but they clearly can't replace and they can't be a substitute for relationships and institutions. And like people and place, relational institutions can be good and bad. Of course they can be. They can be oppressive and exploitative, just as they can be genuinely emancipatory and liberating. But to misunderstand the importance of relationships and institutions, to think that they are secondary and that somehow the transactional and the sort of network type is now, or should be, primary, I think, is to make this fundamental anthropological error. And then I suppose, finally, and to come to sort of preliminary conclusion, as it were, it's to say that it's difficult to envision a democracy that actually is vibrant and plural and at the same time has some sense of common purpose, unless we at least have a continued debate and discernment of what might be good or goods. I'm not saying the good, because I think that might be too ambitious, but at least to rehabilitate language around good and goods. Because it seems to me that if we follow the liberal path and we think that rights are more fundamental than the good or goods, then I think we again make an anthropological error, because I think Aristotle had a right. Most people intuitively think that there are goods internal to human activities. There's such a thing as being a good parent or a good neighbor or a good citizen or a good colleague. And however much we might disagree on what that is, notice we can't bracket the good out of the conversation. We can't do what John Rawls did by saying, well, justice got nothing to do with goodness. It's all about just distributing rights and so on. And I'm only slightly simplifying Rawls. So, the good is again more primary than rights. But because rights really are important, the only way to honor that and to take human rights and individual rights seriously is also to talk about mutual obligations, because the two are inextricably intertwined. There's no sense in which we can just start with individual entitlements and work our way sort of towards a social contract from there, because ultimately when our individual rights and freedoms clash, as they always do, the question is who arbitrates, and who arbitrates tends to be the central state. So the central state will have to make some judgment about whose interests or whose power comes first. Whereas if you have a sense of mutual obligation, then you are building in a sense of self-restraint, you're building in a sense of compromise, because you can't have it all your way until the state decides that it's your way or someone else's. And again, I'm slightly simplifying, but not, I think, all that much. So, yes to individual rights and freedoms, of course, and never to roll back what's been achieved. But to say that actually in the end that rights-based politics only works with a much stronger sense of mutual obligation. And again, I think that will be a form of saying that there are goods. That owing something to others, having duties, is important. And that doesn't just go for others, it also goes for ourselves. We owe something to ourselves. Work hard, try and perfect the talents we've been given, be good parents and citizens and colleagues and so on. I mean, this is something we actually have an obligation, because it's about trying to only a little bit perfect our very imperfect nature. But it's also to say that the sense of duty, extends much beyond the political or the economic or the social. It is fundamentally concerned with nature. That we have a much more holistic understanding of how we are a very small part of nature, that we inhabit a natural universe that exceeds and transcends us, and that we have so cruelly undermined and destroyed, especially in recent decades and centuries. And then we recover a much richer sense of what it is to be human, which is also to be animal, and also to be part of the natural world. And I think that then takes me to the fundamental argument, and I will conclude on this, which is ultimately this is about some of the most profound, you might say, humanist foundations of culture and civilization. Two terms perhaps I should be more careful with, but I'll again put them out there for discussion at this point, to say that whether we come at this from a broadly religious, theological approach or point of view, or indeed a more secular one, where we are now raises profound questions about what makes us human. And there are, in the end, not that many different answers. There is essentially an answer that consists in saying our nature is depraved, it's so deeply fallen and imperfect that we must simply try and replace humanity with something else. So either, sort of think ourselves as godlike, where we can just be what we want based on sheer will to power, or else something will replace our humanity, say with technology, or enhance it, or ultimately robots and others become a substitute for it. So that apparently it's more desirable to get married to a robot or be cared for by one than a fellow human being. And again, I'm only slightly simplifying. Or else you actually think that what makes us human is frailty, is precisely our fallenness, and that there is some good in that after all. Because that recognition will again lead to a form of self-restraint, not to have that kind of will to power, not to think that we can be like God or like the gods, and to think that actually more humility and therefore concern and care for others is what will actually ultimately redeem us, as well as an openness to that transcendent horizon. We might call it grace, right? And that would be the way I would think about it. And so in the end, the pivot of contemporary politics isn't left or right, isn't state or market, isn't the individual or the collective, isn't liberal or populist. It's essentially the human or that which denies it.